Today is Friday, 16th August, and I think it's fair to say that over the last 24 to 36 hours, the essential folly of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk has become ever more clear, even as the mighty Wurlitzer of the Western media chorus cheering it on grows ever louder. This has been a strange affair in that respect. When the incursion into Kursk began, the Western media was relatively silent about it. They spent a great deal of silence over it for the first couple of days. Last 3 or 4 days, at least in Britain, they've been talking about it far more than they did previously. And over the last couple of days, as I said, it's often grown in volumes to tremendous levels. Now, this is strange and not entirely explicable, and it is certainly not in accord with the situation on the ground. And here I should say that I'm speaking both about information that the Russians, obviously, but even if you look between the lines, the Ukrainians themselves are disclosing, because it's become increasingly obvious now that the original objective of this operation, which was and can only have been the Kursk nuclear power station, is now conclusively beyond reach. And even if you start deciphering even Ukrainian accounts of what is actually happening on the ground, it looks clear that it becomes immediately clear that the offensive itself has stalled. By way of illustration, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, announced proudly yesterday that the Ukrainians now have complete control of Sudzha. The Ukrainians have at various times, or at least various channels in Ukraine, have reported that Sudzha is fully under their control. Zelensky finally came round to saying that yesterday. It's possible that this is true, but I have to say that if so, this is more a signal of failure than success. Sudzha, small town, 5,000 people, almost on the border itself, was the place which the Ukrainians presumably must have expected to capture in the first couple of days. We are now well into the second week of this offensive. And to be frank, I'm not even completely convinced, even as of this moment, that Zelensky's claim that the Ukrainians do control the whole of Sudzha is true. There's still a lack of proper film evidence from the town. But, I'm going to go along with Zelensky's claim for what it's worth and assume that it is. But anyway, let's put aside what's going on in Kursk. When we get to the discussion of the situation in Kursk, we will quickly see that, in fact, the Ukrainians are now effectively in standstill. They've made various attempts to attack in various directions, but their breakout, is now limited to a relatively small territory on the border, and they're not able, so it seems, to penetrate further, despite the fairly substantial forces that they have concentrated on this territory and in its immediate vicinity. But even as the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk has stalled, the Russians have taken advantage of the diversion of Ukrainian troops from various parts of the contact line to accelerate their offensive, and they're doing so to devastating effect. Now, I think the word devastating is not over-exaggerated. Now, before I get into the weeds about that, let me just say a few things. Admiral Kirby in the United States, he's now the spokesman, as I understand it, of the National Security Council. He's come along and he has said that the Russians have transferred troops from the Donbass front lines to Kursk. There's, in fact, very little evidence indeed that this is the case to any extent. 2 Russian units, one can say, were deployed to the Kursk area. One was a tank brigade or tank unit, which was sent to the Sudzha area, to the Kursk area, by a group of forces north. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided extensive information about this, and we have pictures, and we see the tanks operating in Kursk region. I don't know how many of these tanks there are. Interestingly, I haven't seen much evidence that the Ukrainians have been particularly successful in destroying any of these tanks. But anyway, they're there, and they assist the various special forces in conducting the usual ambush operations in Kursk region that I will discuss later in this program. So there is that tank unit that was deployed there by a group of forces north. And we also know that a Marine brigade, Naval Infantry Brigade, the one that is attached to the Black Sea Fleet, was redeployed to Kursk region from Kherson region. But interestingly, and very importantly, that redeployment appears to have taken place before the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk began. And that is an important fact, one which, as I've said, corroborates a lot of the information that I have been provided by the source that I've been discussing in my various programs. So we know that these 2 units are in this area. The Marine unit is a very powerful force, roughly 4,000 men in total, highly trained, and, by the way, rested. This is the force that was operating in Kherson region. They played a role, I believe, in clearing Krinky, the bridgehead that the Ukrainians attempted to create on the west bank of the east bank, the Russian-controlled east bank of the Dnieper River. Some of their troops might have been involved in the various Russian operations to clear the islands in the Dnieper. I don't know a huge amount about that, and it doesn't seem as if large numbers of troops were involved in that operation. But mostly, over the last few months, this particular brigade, which is very much an elite brigade, has been resting and has been retraining and receiving reinforcements and supplies. So we're talking about a brigade that is both an elite brigade and a veteran brigade and a relatively fresh brigade. And it has been deployed to this area, and it has been involved now in several of the battles, and they've been producing lots of pictures of what they've been doing. Now, there are other Russian units of the Russian regular army that are starting to appear in this area, though there are very few details as to who and which they are, but they do not seem to have been redeployed from the Donbass fronts. I've read reports that in total the Russians have in the area engaging the Ukrainians between around 9 regiments and brigades, and that this is a force roughly of the same number or perhaps slightly bigger than the Ukrainian force that is operating in Kursk on Russian territory, in Kursk region, which is now said to number 15,000 men. The original spearhead force was said to number around 12,000 men. That's increased to 15,000. The Russians have the same, or perhaps slightly more, troops of various descriptions from various different units operating in Kursk region themselves. I am going to guess that the bulk of these forces have have continued to take up defensive positions around Lgov, the village of Lgov, another village called Risk, and of course Kurchatev itself. These are the places where the big fortifications we've been seeing have been created by the Russians. The Russians, their priority has been to shield the Kursk nuclear power plant, but as we will come to discuss later, it does seem now as if the Russians have been making significant counterattacks, and unless we are getting, unless the information we're getting is distorted in some way, which it might be, it does look as if the situation in Kursk has achieved a kind of temporary stability. But overall, there has been little sign of any mass deployment of Russian troops from the Donbass front lines. What Admiral Kirby is saying does not seem to correspond with the facts. On the contrary, the Russians continue to reinforce their forces on the Donbass front lines, and they continue to advance, and in some places the advance now is becoming very rapid. By contrast, the Ukrainians have diverted significant forces from the Donbass front lines, and according to Russian claims, as we shall eventually see, because Ukrainian losses in Kursk region are high, the Ukrainians are becoming obliged to reinforce their troops there, taking more of their reserves and more of their troops from the front lines and drawing more reserves into the black hole, which is the offensive in Kursk region. This has become, for the Ukrainian government, a prestige operation. It's become a matter of, shall we say, I won't even say pride. It's become the main theme for the Ukrainians, that they're still in the battle, that they actually occupy Russian territory, even if it's only a small number of scattered villages on the western border of Russia. And they're committing more and more of their forces to holding this useless territory, even as the Russians advance. And there was an article in the US media yesterday, in Politico, where Ukrainian soldiers in one of the front lines that matters, the one that's really mattered, the one in Pokrovsk, were complaining that since the operation in Kursk began, their supplies of ammunition, of shells, of armoured vehicles, and indeed of reinforcements have been dwindling, even as the Russians continue their advance. Now, yesterday in my programme, I discussed at considerable length the importance of Pokrovsk, and it is with the Battle of Pokrovsk I'm going to start. Yesterday, I said how enormously important Pokrovsk is, how it is in some ways the hinge of the entire Ukrainian defense system in Donbass, and by the way, by extension, in eastern Ukraine. In the event that Pokrovsk falls, Ukraine faces a major operational crisis, and that is an understatement. And I also said that if the Russians are able to consolidate their positions in Pokrovsk and use Pokrovsk as a base for further offensives westwards along the main road leading from Pokrovsk through the big town of Pavlograd to the Dnieper and to the city of Dnipro itself, then the crisis for Ukraine will become not just critical, it will become existential. Yesterday, I also said that there were signs that the Ukrainian defense of Pokrovsk was very disorganized, that despite the onset of the Russian army, the fact that the Russian army was moving ever closer towards Pokrovsk, that it is only a few kilometers away. There had been no announcement, no decision yet made to evacuate Pokrovsk of its civilian population and to start taking the necessary steps to defend the town. Well, just a few hours after I made my video, in fact, shortly after it was published, I believe, the city government of Pokrovsk gave the evacuation order. They said that the entire civilian population of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd now must leave the town because the Russians are roughly 10 kilometers from it and are coming closer. It's been left very late, but it is now happening. And here, before I proceed, just one point. I have been discussing in various programs the fact that Mirnograd, there's been various reports about attacks by the Russians on an airfield in a place which I understood to be Mirnograd. I was starting to have doubts that Mirnograd, where the airfield is, can be the Mirnograd where close to Pokrovsk, which the Russians are now approaching. Somebody then stepped in and very helpfully explained to me the actual geography. There are apparently two places. The names are not identical. One is Mirnograd, which is the place near Pokrovsk, which the Russians, of course, continue to refer to as Dmitrov. And the other is another place called Mirgograd, which is located considerably further north in Poltava region, west of Kharkiv, and that is where the airfield is located. So can I just express my thanks to that person for that extremely helpful clarification, which has settled a number of mysteries for me as to where exactly this airfield is located. The airfield is not close to Pokrovsk or to Mirnograd, as I had earlier believed, and my previous assumptions that it was are obviously wrong. Anyway, let's now turn to what is happening in the area of Pokrovsk. And yesterday I discussed how the Russians, by some reports, had captured various villages close to Pokrovsk, and I wasn't completely sure whether those reports were necessarily true, but as I suspected, it turns out that they were. Firstly, it does seem that the Russians do now control the villages of Mykolaievka, Orlovka, and Zhuravka, which are located southwest of the important village of Grodivka on the main highway to Mirnograd, the TO 511 highway. And incidentally, there are now some reports that the Russians also control two other villages, Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar. The Mykolaievka that the Russians have captured is indeed the Mykolaievka, the more southerly of the three Mykolaievkas that I had identified. And moreover, it's now been confirmed that the Russians are advancing from these places, and they seem to be approaching the important village or community of Novogrodivka. Novogrodivka is apparently essentially a Soviet creation. Like many of these places that the Soviets built, it has these apartment buildings there, concrete brick and concrete apartment buildings, which can sometimes be converted into fortified positions. So, in theory, it ought to be more defendable than some of the other villages, which basically consist of wooden izbas, cottages. But the same was once said about Progress, and the Russians were able to capture Progress very rapidly. Maybe they will capture Novogrodivka also. Now, Novogrodivka is located some further distance from Pokrovsk, but it is important in one important respect, which is that it is actually very close to Selidovo, which is the other big hub. Well, it's not particularly big. It's about 10,000 people, I believe. But it's a hub, again, a logistics hub for the Ukrainians, which the Ukrainians use to keep their forces in, to send supplies through to Kurakovo, and ultimately from Kurakovo onward towards places like, well, formerly Krasnogorovka, which is now largely, of course, now largely under Russian control, and beyond Kurakovo to the fortified town of Vuhledar. So if the Russians are able to capture Novogrodivka, it looks as if they are actually very close to Selidovo. It may be that they will move on to attack Selidovo. Selidovo places, as I said, of about 10,000 people. It's not clear how strongly defended that town is, but the fall of Selidovo would be a major blow for the Ukrainians, not, of course, on the scale that the fall of Pokrovsk itself would be, but nonetheless, it would be a blow. And if the Ukrainians lose Selidovo, then their whole defense position in the south, places like Kurakovo, the two western roads leading out of Krasnogorovka, where the Russians are said to be advancing, incidentally, and of course Vuhledar, the whole defense position there starts to look basically undefendable. So anyway, this is an important advance, and it's been confirmed anyway that the Russians have indeed captured this village, the village of Mykolaievka, which is located, the southern Mykolaievka, which is actually located to the southeast of Novogrodivka. And in fact, there are pictures. We now have confirmation of this because there's actually film showing Russian armored vehicles in this particular village. And there was a report, by the way, that the Ukrainians tried to counterattack and drive the Russians out of the village, but that the counterattack was repelled and that the Russians have consolidated their positions in this village. Now, the other thing to say about Mykolaievka is that it lies astride the main road leading to Zhelanye, another village which has been fought over for some time. There are many reports, actually, that the Russians control the village, control Zhelanye. That's a village further to the east. This used to be, apparently, the village which the Ukrainians used as their major command post in this area. So presumably the headquarters that was located there has been withdrawn. But anyway, there's been a lot of fighting around there, and there's said to be a significant grouping of Ukrainian troops to the south and east of Zhelanye. In previous reports that have appeared on the TASS news agency, anonymous Russian military officials have spoken about the encirclement of Ukrainian troops in the Zhelanya area, and it's been widely assumed that it's these troops south of Zhelanya that are being referred to. With the road which passes through Mykolaiivka, and which, by the way, originates in Novogrodovka, now cut, the supply road now cut, the Russians now controlling the road. It's the supply route to these troops in this area south of Zhelanya has basically been cut as well. There are other roads that the Ukrainians could use further south, but it might be difficult for them to keep supplies moving there. That would be a significant detour. The journey time would be extended. And as has been pointed out by various people, these roads anyway, including the road that used to pass through Mykolaiivka, are constantly monitored by Russian drones, and apparently large numbers of Ukrainian supply vehicles that have tried to use these roads have been destroyed by Russian drones, by Russian suicide drones. In fact, the military summary channel, and I believe some other channels, have taken to referring to these roads as the roads of death. That might be a bit overstated. But anyway, I'm going to make a guess that the Ukrainians are going to withdraw their troops. They're going to try to withdraw their troops from the Zhelanya area within the next couple of hours. If they fail to do so, those troops, perhaps several hundred, risk final encirclement. So anyway, a fairly dramatic situation there in the south, but the situation further north, in some respects, is more serious still. Now, I've said that the Russians are fighting to control the area around, have now attacked the village of Grodivka itself, that there is considerable fighting going on in Grodivka. There are some reports that the Russians control around 40% of this village. It's not clear that that is necessarily the case, but it could be. The Russian Defense Ministry this morning has confirmed that Ivanivka and Lysychnoe are under Russian control. These are villages that lie to the east of Grodivka, and Veselye itself is also under Russian control. There are also reports, however, that the Russians have captured the two other villages in this area, Sviridonivka and Novotoretske. These villages are located to the north of Grodivka. So Grodivka is being taken into a semicircle, and it is likely that over the next couple of hours, the Russians will launch a major attack on Grodivka from the north. It is likely that Grodivka itself will fall at some point within the next couple of hours or perhaps days. And the forces that are advancing in this direction, the Russian forces that are advancing in this direction, have now been given what one might call a call to arms by none other than the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov. He is spurring them on in their advance on Pokrovsk itself. There's a most interesting comment that Belousov has made on his Telegram channel, his own personal Telegram channel, but the Russian Defense Ministry has now republished it, and I'm going to read it. It reads as follows. head of Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov sends telegram to formation deployed in special military operations zone. I correct that. He did not write this on his personal telegram channel. He sent a personal message to this lead unit that is advancing through these villages towards Pokrovsk. And it must be stressed that we're talking about one particular unit. And it goes on, the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say, head of the Russian military department, in other words, Belousov, congratulated the command and personnel of the 74th Separate Guards Zvenigorod Berlin Order of Suvorov Second Class Motorized Rifle Brigade on the liberation of Ivanovka. In the Special Military Operations Zone, the brigade servicemen break through the enemy's defense and continue to liberate the Donetsk soil. During battles for Avdiivka, Berdichi, and Novo-Alexandrovka, the brigade's personnel showed an example of resilience and valor. Today, you are confidently advancing in Krasnoarmeysk direction. As a result of your professional and decisive actions, the enemy suffers significant losses and withdraws to the west. Now, Krasnoarmeysk is, of course, Pokrovsk. It was the name Pokrovsk had during the Soviet era. The Ukrainians changed it to Pokrovsk. Maybe it was its pre-Soviet name, I don't know. But anyway, when Belousov talks about Krasnoarmeysk, he means Pokrovsk. And he says, today you are confidently advancing in the Krasnoarmeysk direction. And the Defense Ministry then goes on to say, this is them, not Belousov. Today the Guardsmen selflessly and skillfully perform their military duty and carry out combat tasks, bringing our victory closer. The Russian Defense Minister thanked the servicemen for successfully performing combat tasks, loyalty to military duties and oaths, and expressed confidence that they would continue to honorably serve Russia, reliably ensuring the security of the country. So that looks to me like basically telling this force, the 74th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, note a light infantry brigade, they moving forward on BTR wheeled armoured vehicles. This is not a tank force or a mechanized infantry force, but it is a force of the regular Russian army. Anyway, he's telling them to keep going and to keep moving west towards Pokrovsk. That is how I interpret this message. So there is going to be no slackening of the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk. And all of the indications are, this statement by Belousov, the pace of the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk, that the Russians not only have Pokrovsk in their sights, but that they do intend to storm the town. And I would say that whilst the 74th Motorized Rifle Brigade is, of course, a rifle, is a light infantry force, the Russian Defense Ministry has also perhaps pointedly and intentionally published a further report just directly after Belousov's comments discussing the work of a Russian tank force in what they say is the Avdiivka area, which presumably means the same area where this fighting is taking place, though it's likely that this tank force is operating further south, maybe not in Grodivka, and I'm assuming that since the 74th Rifle Brigade captured Ivanovka, at least according to we're told this by Belousov, since the 74th Rifle Brigade captured Grodivka, it's probably the lead force conducting the attack on Grodivka. I expect that the tank force that the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about is operating further south, probably in the area around Zelanye, and maybe advancing towards these villages of Mykolaievka, Orlovka, and Novogrodivka that I was talking about earlier in the program. Anyway, these are dramatic and serious advances. To repeat again, the importance of Pokrovsk should not be understated. If Zelensky is right, and the Ukrainians are indeed in control of Sudzha, it is in no conceivable way an equivalent capture to the potential loss of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, much bigger place, strategically located. Sudzha itself, small town, 5,000 people on the border. It in itself has no military or strategic value. Anyway, it's not just in the Pokrovsk direction that things are turning out disastrously for the Ukrainians. And as I said, we must now, it seems to me, be looking forward to a Russian attempt to storm Pokrovsk. This does not look like what happened in the Kupiansk area last autumn, where the Russians advanced up to the village of Sinkovka and then stopped. Belousov's comment suggests that at the moment, for the moment at least, the Russians intend to go further and storm and capture Pokrovsk itself. But this is not the only place where the Russians are moving and are now moving fast, taking advantage, as I said, of the fact that the Ukrainians in all of these places are weakening themselves through their overinvestment in the Kursk offensive. And the other place where we've had dramatic news is the Toretsk sector. Now, a group of Russian soldiers have provided photograph of themselves in a building which nobody apparently can identify, but they say that the whole of the village of Zalizny, probably including the coal mine to the north of it, is now under complete Russian control. They photographed themselves, as I said, in this building, and there's a message from this unit. I'm not quite clear which unit it is. I think actually that it's most likely a unit that formerly belonged to the Donetsk militia, but I might be wrong about that. Anyway, they're now claiming that Zalizny, the village of Zalizny, south east of Toretsk, is now fully under Russian control. And there's been a cascade of news about the situation around the village of New York, other big fortified position. I can remember that for many years, up to the start of the offensive by the Russians in the Toretsk area, New York itself was talked of as a very, very heavily fortified position. Well, I said some days ago that there were reports circulating that New York has fallen completely under Russian control. It's not clear whether that is, still not clear whether that is actually correct, but there is no doubt at all, and there's been apparently lots of film confirmation that the Russians control not just most of the urban area of New York, but all of the area immediately to the east and west of New York itself, with the Russians probably advancing also westwards towards places like Alexandropil and those villages along the H20 highway that I've discussed in various programs. So it looks as if the Russians, as I said, are either close to capturing New York or have already done so. There's also a report that the Russians have in effect encircled a group of Ukrainian soldiers, several hundred in fact, in a number of industrial buildings located immediately to the north of New York in the direction of the village of Nelipivka. Again, I can't comment on whether or not that is true. It may be, but, who knows. But one way or the other, it does look as if the situation south of Toretsk is becoming very critical. But perhaps even more concerning from a Ukrainian point of view about what, in connection with developments in the Toretsk direction, around Toretsk, is that there are now reports, in fact, they're not reports, there's been film published by the Russian Defense Ministry, which shows the Russians launching an offensive across the Seversky Donets aqueduct, the very same aqueduct that passes through Chasiv Yar. The pipes that make it up move all the way down south towards the city of Gorlovka, which has been under Russian control ever since the 2014 fighting. Anyway, there are pictures, film has apparently been provided by the Russian Defense Ministry, which shows Russian troops advancing across the aqueduct and moving westwards from the small town of Kurdyumovka, which is firmly under Russian control and which lies just east of the aqueduct. Now, Kurdyumovka was actually captured by the Wagner organization last year, I seem to remember, and the early part of last year, or it might have been in the last months of 2022. I don't remember exactly when, but it was actually captured by the Wagner organization in connection with the Battle of Bakhmut. The Wagner organization captured Kurdyumovka, which is apparently one of these industrial villages, presumably connected with the coal mining industry. It was a difficult battle, as I remember, to capture Kurdyumovka. Anyway, they captured Kurdyumovka and the two villages to the north of Kurdyumovka, Andreevka, which is a tiny place, and the somewhat larger village of Kleshevka further north. The Ukrainians made many attempts over the course of 2023, their own counteroffensive in 2023, to recapture Kleshevka. At one point, they claimed that they had done so, and certainly they had troops in Kleshevka, though I've heard lots of reports that they never fully consolidated control of Kleshevka. Anyway, some weeks ago, the Russian Defense Ministry said that Kleshevka has passed back under Russian control, and there's been no word about Andreevka. I don't know what is going on there. But Kurdyumovka itself has always remained under Russian control. There were, again, reports last year that had the Ukrainians ever succeeded in consolidating control of Kleshevka, they would have then moved on to try to capture Kurdyumovka. And in fact, there were even pictures published by the Ukrainians of Ukrainian reconnaissance groups which arrived right up to the outskirts of Kurdyumovka itself. And I remember this caused quite a stir at the time, and there were all sorts of people worrying on the Russian side that meant that the Ukrainians were on the brink of capturing Kurdyumovka, but it never happened. Anyway, Kurdyumovka remains firmly under Russian control, and of course it is an important village lying between Bakhmut and Toretsk, and as we can see, it is relevant to the battle for both of these places. The Battle of Bakhmut, which the Russians won last year, and the Battle of Toretsk, which is now underway. Now, the point is that if the Russians are advancing westwards from Kurdyumovka, that opens up the possibility of a Russian attack on Toretsk from the north, a pincer attack by the Russians on Kurdyumovka, on Toretsk rather. And this is, again, very like the style that the Russians follow. When they attack a fortified position, they tend not to want to attack just from one direction, allowing the Ukrainians to concentrate their defense in one place. They like to attack from multiple directions, all at the same time. And that, it seems, is what they're preparing to do. It's also possible, if you look at where Kurdyumovka is on a map relative to Toretsk, that the Russians might be hoping to cut off the supply lines to Toretsk from Konstantinovka. But I'm not going to go and discuss that because I'm not really able to talk about this. I think that's moving too far ahead anyway. But anyway, the fact that the Russians are now starting this advance from Kurdyumovka also suggests that a storming operation for Toretsk is now going to take place. The Russians apparently are already inside the metropolitan area of Toretsk. They've advanced into Toretsk, the eastern end of Toretsk, from the village of Pivnichne, which they also already control, and which they captured, in fact, some time ago. But it looks as if they're preparing for an attack on Toretsk from the north. There are various places between Kurdyumovka and Toretsk which perhaps they would need to capture. There's a village called Ozaryanivka. Maybe they control it already. I'm not sure. More closer to Toretsk, there's a village called Dachny. I don't know how big a place it is. From the map, it doesn't look to be big at all. But anyway, one way or the other, Ukrainian positions around Toretsk are now looking extremely precarious. The Russians are on the southern boundaries of Toretsk. Probably the village of Nelipivka will be captured fairly soon, with New York having fallen. The Russians look like they're going to be advancing before long along these various villages to the west of the H20 highway, Alexandropil and all of those others. And one way or the other, it looks as if Toretsk itself is going to be taken in a pincer, and we're going to see a storming operation of that important town. And we have continued to receive little information from the Chasiv Yar battlefronts. Suffice to say that with Chasiv Yar, this is fairly standard. We get no information, often for weeks at a time. And then we discover that there's been lots of developments in Chasiv Yar, and that the Russians have captured significant positions in and around Chasiv Yar, and I suspect that is what's happening as well. So, the Russian offensive across the Donbass continues. It continues unabated. We know of a critical situation for the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk, and we can see that a critical situation for the Ukrainians around Toretsk is also developing. And for the moment, it doesn't seem as if the Ukrainians have significant reserves to hold all of this back, because Zelensky and Syrskyi, who's telling everybody in private that he opposed this operation in Kursk region, even as he publishes pieces on his Telegram channel telling us how the Ukrainians are continuing their advance in Kursk region. I cannot myself see what evidence he has for that, but we'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, even as he publicly endorses this operation in in Kursk. He is publicly committed to it, privately distancing himself from it, very much like General Zaluzhny used to do. And in the meantime, exactly as many predicted, what the Kursk operation is doing is it's sucking up Ukrainian reserves and equipment, which are, as a result, being denied to the front lines in Donbass, where the war is going to be won or lost. Well, let's now turn to the situation on the northern front lines. And by the way, I'm going to include what is happening in Kharkiv, the Kharkiv area, because all of these battles, the battles in Kharkiv area and in Kursk area, are interconnected. They both, for the record, fall under the jurisdiction of Group of Forces North. Now, Group of Forces North have provided us with their own update of the military situation, which I'm going to turn to first. And then the Russian Defense Ministry has also provided us with its account. So we have accounts from two official Russian sources. One is Group of Forces North, who provided this with their account on their Telegram channel, and the other, as I said, is the Defense Ministry itself, which gives us its own slightly different account from the one that Group of Forces North is giving us. However, before I talk about that, before I discuss what the Russians are saying about the fighting in Kharkiv and Kursk region, let me say that over the last 24 hours, official Russian spokesmen have come out and they've made absolutely clear that they do not believe the American denials that the Western powers were kept by the Ukrainians in ignorance of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk region. All of the Russians have said quite clearly that the Ukrainians would never have been able to conduct an operation of this nature unless the Americans and the other Western powers had been intimately involved in its preparation and planning. And the person who's said this in the most forthright way is Putin's former national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev. He was the man who was in overall charge until recently of the Russian intelligence services. I am sure he's still an aide to Putin. I've no doubt, in fact, that he continues to receive intelligence information. And this is what Patrushev says. It was the West that brought the junta to power in Ukraine. NATO countries sent weapons and military instructors to Ukraine. They continue to provide them with intelligence data and they control their actions. The undertaking, he by the way uses stronger language, I'm tempering his language, the undertaking, and he means here the Kursk operation, was prompted by the Kiev regime's realization of its looming imminent collapse. It's common for the United States to say one thing and do just the opposite. Without their participation and direct endorsement, Kiev would have never dared to set its foot on Russian territory. And this is what Patrushev has said in an interview he has given to the Russian newspaper Izvestia. And I've no doubt he's right, by the way. I think that all the various attempts by various agencies of the US government, especially the State Department, to pretend that they had no knowledge of this operation are almost certainly true. I think that maybe the US wasn't provided with all the details, or perhaps more accurately, it may be not all of the agencies that make up the incredibly complicated government of the United States in Washington were provided with all the details. But I suspect that some of them, or that all of them, knew that something was being prepared, and that some of them not only were aware of the entire operation, including the objective to seize the nuclear power plant near Kursk, the one in Kurchatov, but at least one of them, one of the intelligence agencies, the CIA to be precise, certainly the Russians believe that it was involved in planning that part of the operation as well. And I think that might be true, though of course the CIA will never confirm that. Anyway, there we are. That's my view. It's the Russian view. We'll see whether the US itself comes out and confirms it one day or denies it. We'll find out one way or the other eventually. But what I think is irrelevant, it's what the Russians think that matters. And the Russians, I'm sure, do think this. I think they're sincere in what they're saying. And of course, and this is the key thing to understand, it's what they're telling their friends and their allies. It's what they're telling the Indian government, the Chinese government, the Brazilian government, all of these governments, that, look, what has just happened? You've been trying to get us to agree to negotiations with the Ukrainians and ultimately with the Americans as well. We've repeatedly told you that we're not, in principle, opposed to negotiations. We set out what our terms for negotiations are. Putin did so in a speech that he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board a few weeks ago. But even as the other side pretend that they are interested in negotiations, they, not just the Ukrainians, but the Americans themselves, were instead plotting this raid to try to seize a nuclear power plant. You see how unreliable and untrustworthy and irresponsible these people are. How can you expect us to negotiate with them in good faith? And I'm sure that's the message that is being conveyed, and I have no doubt that it is finding a receptive audience in several of the capitals of the countries I've just mentioned, especially Beijing, where of course the Chinese have experienced their own problems with the Americans. I repeat again, no less a person than Xi Jinping once said over the course of a summit meeting, according to a Chinese readout, to none other than President Biden, you tell me one thing and your administration goes and does something completely different. So how can I trust you? So there we go. Let's move on and see what Group of Forces North are telling us about the situation in Kursk and about the situation in Kharkiv. Group of Forces North say this. On August 15th, Group of Forces North continued to carry out tasks to destroy the enemy in the border areas of Kursk Oblast. Thanks to well-coordinated work of units of Group of Forces North and the high losses of the Ukrainians, the enemy's offensive has run out of steam. In other words, it's been stalled. The enemy is entrenched on the reached borders and unsuccessfully tries to break through towards Lvov. So the Ukrainians are basically strung out in various villages close to the border. The Russian governor of Kursk region, Smirnov, has said that the Ukrainian presence is in a territory that is about 15, that stretches about 15 kilometers beyond the border and is around 40 kilometers wide. And I think that is where the Ukrainians actually are. They do, however, from time to time, or have from time to time, tried to advance beyond this block of territory that they control. And their major objective has been to reach a village called Lgov. Lgov is located close to Kurchatov. And of course, Kurchatov is where the nuclear power plant is located. And according to Group of Forces North, all of their many attempts to break through to Lgov have been unsuccessful. And then Group of Forces North continue to tell us the situation remains tense in Martinovka, where fighters of Group of Forces North repelled another attack of the Ukrainians, destroying up to 20 Ukrainian soldiers. That looks like 20 Ukrainian soldiers actually killed in a battle, another Ukrainian attempt to try to capture Martinovka, which I think it is now widely acknowledged by every party is fully under Russian control. And then Group of Forces North says, in the direction of Korenovo, that's the town to the north west, which is the other place where the Ukrainians, it's another place which the Ukrainians have been trying to capture. The idea is if they can capture Korenovo, they can swerve northeastwards and try and reach Lgov from that direction. In the area of Korenovko, 2 attacks on the settlements of Apanasovka and Troitskoye were repulsed, with a total of up to 90 Ukrainian soldiers and 8 armored vehicles being destroyed, of whom, were repulsed with, this force is about 90 men with on 8 armored vehicles. 40 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Then there was a Ukrainian attempt to break through to Belgorod. This has been widely covered by other bloggers. I haven't touched on it so much, but Group of Forces North say that in the Belgorod area, after fierce fighting, the enemy was driven back from the Kolotirovka checkpoint. This is a checkpoint on the actual border. Up to 15 Ukrainian troops and 1 tank covering the retreating enemy were destroyed by artillery fire and FPV drones. And then Group of Forces North turns to the situation in Kharkiv region. Fighting continues in Volchansk. In the area of the multi-story buildings, assault groups of Group of Forces North started clearing another entrance of an apartment building. And it looks as if one building after another gradually is falling under Russian control. And then it goes on to say during the day, the enemy made 1 attack on the Staritsa settlement. It was unsuccessful. Fire damage was inflicted by drops from drones. The losses of the enemy amounted to 11 fighters. This is an interesting post because a lot of bloggers and reporters and mapping projects have suggested that Staritsa is under Ukrainian control, but Group of Forces North here is telling us that in fact it is under Russian control. Just saying. Anyway, they then go on to say in towards Lipsy, Group of Forces North continue to push the enemy out of the Dacha village north of Lipsy. Strikes by drones and artillery, Group of Forces North hit 2 concentrations of the enemy manpower. Up to 9 enemy soldiers were killed. Over the past 24 hours, enemy losses amounted to 460 enemy troops, including up to 360 in the Sumy direction. Now this is, as we will see, somewhat different numbers from those provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. They are higher, but anyway, one can find some way to reconcile these figures. But I suspect what has happened is the Group of Forces North give their reports, the Russian Defense Ministry go over them, they check the losses, they probably take a more conservative approach in calculating Ukrainian losses than Group of Forces North do, and that explains why the figures that the Defense Ministry gives tend to be lower than the figures the Group of Forces North give. Significantly, the Group of Forces North says that over the course of the previous 24 hours, in the Kursk and Sumy areas, the Ukrainians lost 4 tanks, and in the Kharkiv area, they lost 1 tank. Now, we happen to know that one of those tanks that was destroyed, apparently in Kursk itself, that is to say, on Russian territory, was a British Challenger 2 tank operated by the Ukrainian 82nd Airborne Brigade. The interesting thing, the curious thing, is that the Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North are not mentioning the fact. The British media very excitedly was publishing yesterday all kinds of claims and reports about how British tanks are now operating in Kursk on Russian territory. A fact which I would have thought ought to cause concern in London. After all, British tanks are being used on the territory of a country, Russia, the world's biggest nuclear power, which is not at war, with which Britain is not at war. Incredibly dangerous and reckless thing to do. Very shortly after some of these enthusiastic articles appeared in London in the British media, we had film provided by the Russians showing a Challenger 2 being destroyed by a Lancet drone. We can say definitely that the Challenger 2 in question was destroyed because the tank was destroyed in an ambush well inside Russian territory. And the Russians have had access to the wreckage, and they've taken close-up pictures of the destroyed vehicle, and it is unequivocally a Challenger 2 tank. So there we are. It looks as if one of these 4 tanks that was destroyed in the Kursk and Sumy regions was a British Challenger 2 tank. But the Russians have not mentioned the fact, and I suspect that the reason that this has happened is because the Russians worry that if they did disclose this rather critical information, then there would be calls within Russia for retaliation directly against Britain, given that British armoured vehicles are now operating on Russian territory. And as I've discussed many times, the Russian government wants to keep the situation under control. They're not bothered by the presence of a few tanks on their territory. They're confident that they can deal with that, but they don't want a further escalation. And why would they, given that as things are going, they're in the process of winning the war? And then Group of Forces North, as it so often does, then gives us a rundown, a summary of its own sort of view of the overall situation. As a result of the coordinated work of aerial reconnaissance and accuracy of our missileers, another HIMARS multiple launch rocket system was destroyed in Sumy region. In fact, 3 HIMARS vehicles, HIMARS launchers, have been destroyed apparently over a 36-hour period in Sumy region. the Ukrainians brought them close to the border. That has exposed them to Russian observation and rapid destruction. And Group of Forces North goes on to say, thanks to this, no missile attacks on the Kursk border areas have been recorded over the past 24 hours. Since the beginning of the invasion of Kursk region, Ukrainian losses have exceeded the figure of 3,000 fighters, including up to 900 killed. We'll see that the Russian Defense Ministry's calculations are somewhat lower, but not much. 900 killed is a very, very significant loss rate. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say, we are sure that analysing the frames of objective control of destroyed equipment, the Ukrainian command is also aware of these data, and that is why it has begun to pull out units from other directions to send them to Kursk region for disposal. That is a most extraordinary statement. What Group of Forces North is telling us is that Kursk has now become a fire sack, an area where the Ukrainians are being lured to send more and more of their best men and machines, more of their best units, trying to hold on to this territory, which is of no conceivable military value, and that they're being destroyed there. The Russians have turned, in other words, Kursk into, in effect, a type of killing field or killing zone. This brings me back to the information which has been provided to me by this source, because that is exactly what he said the Russians always intended. That was their original plan. He's apparently done some more checks. He says that he now has said conclusively that the Russians most emphatically did know about the Kursk operation in advance. They were aware that it was being prepared. Apparently, some weeks ago, there were expressions of concern about the situation from some of the political figures in Moscow, those connected with the Duma, the Russian parliament. They were then told that they should remain calm, that the government, including Putin himself, were fully aware of what was about to happen and had already made preparations for it and had already developed a plan as to how to deal with it. And Dumin, it seems, this has never been confirmed, was put in overall charge, and the Ukrainians were basically lured into a trap. Now, let me repeat again the point that I made in my program yesterday. When you see evidence stacking up which confirms information that you have been given, persisting in skepticism about that information, which I did express at the beginning, begins to become unsustainable, or at least logically unsustainable. We see Group of Forces North very confident about the situation on the battlefronts, telling us that Kursk has indeed become a destruction zone for Ukraine's best troops and military equipment. And that, as I said, is in effect what the source who's been in contact with me tells me it was always intended to be. He's also told me something else, by the way, which is very interesting, which is that some weeks ago, even as the Russians were preparing for this operation in Kursk, around 200,000 men of the Russian army, contract soldiers, were given furlough. And apparently they were told that at the end of their furlough, they needed to take time off and rest, because at the end of that time period, when the furlough ended, towards the end of this month, they would be tasked with conducting some kind of offensive, specifically in northern Ukraine, in the Sumy area. 200,000 men in total. Now, the point is that all of these things allegedly, and here again I'm passing on what I understand this source to be telling me. I might be misunderstanding some things, but allegedly what happened was the Russians were aware that the Ukrainians were going to launch this operation. They set out to basically destroy Ukrainian reserves, and especially, and in particular, the armoured vehicles, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradleys, the Strykers, the Challenger 2s, all of those, to destroy them in Kursk region, so that when the offensive, when the Russian offensive begins, presumably in the autumn, these armoured forces and these Ukrainian troops will not be there to offer the defence to withstand it. Now, again, as I said, you can accept this or not as you choose, but this source did tip me off that this was going to happen 2 months ago, and we see again more verbal confirmation of what's happening from Group of Forces North. They're saying that the Ukrainians are being lured to send more and more men into Kursk region from right across the battlefronts, even as the battlefronts are collapsing, and that they're giving a strong hint that this is part of an overall plan, a Russian plan. Now, I ought to say quickly that, of course, even if it isn't a plan, that does seem to be the consequence, with the Ukrainians, as I said earlier in the program, having made such a show about this operation in Kursk region. The damage to morale and prestige in Ukraine, if the Ukrainians did the only militarily rational thing, which is pull out from Kursk, would be so enormous that reinforcing in Kursk is probably all that they can realistically do. So even if this isn't a Russian plan, that is the effect of this operation. Either the Ukrainians have walked into a trap that the Russians have set for them, or they have walked into a trap which they set for themselves. But this is how this operation is turning out. Anyway, that is Group of Forces North. The Russian Defense Ministry is giving its own account of the events on the in Kursk, and I will now turn to that because, as I said, it's not identical, but it is in some respects complementary. And they say this: armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel the Ukrainian attempt to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Active actions by Group of Forces North, unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery strikes repelled an attack launched by assault detachments of the Ukrainian 82nd Air Assault Brigade near Ruskoye Porechnoye. Now, that, I suspect, is the area where the Challenger 2 was destroyed, because the 82nd Air Assault Brigade is the unit which is equipped with these tanks. And Ruskoye Porechnoye, as I have discussed, is located immediately to the west of Martinovka, Group of Forces North says that there was an attack towards Martinovka. I suspect that this is the attack. The Russians say that it has been repelled. Alaudinov, the Chechen officer, says that the Russians are in the process of clearing this area of the Ukrainians and basically consolidating control there. Anyway, the Defense Ministry then goes on to say one attack launched by the enemy's assault detachment, supported by 5 armoured vehicles through the state border in the direction of Gorgievka, was repelled. This is the attack that the Ukrainians tried to launch into Belgorod region. It was clearly unsuccessful. Then the Russian Defense Ministry says Army aviation, drones, and artillery fire eliminated the enemy's mobile groups, attempting to get to the depth of the Russian territory 1 kilometre west of Anastasievka and 1.5 kilometres southeast of Kauchuk. Now, these are the places where the Ukrainians have been trying to send columns of armoured vehicles driving up the country roads rapidly towards Lvov. And the Russians have been destroying these columns. They've provided some rather vivid photos of one of these columns, which was completely destroyed, actually north of this area, which the Russians are talking about. The most interesting thing about this particular paragraph is that it discusses how the Ukrainians were destroyed in places that are west of Anastasievka and southeast of Kauchuk, and that suggests that the Russians have been moving further south, because these are further south, from what I can tell, than the previous destruction of these forces, the earlier reconnaissance groups that the Ukrainians were trying to send northwards. And then we have more detailed reports about Russian attacks on Ukrainian positions. It says losses were inflicted on manpower and hardware clusters of the Ukrainian 22nd, 61st Mechanized, 95th Air Assault Brigade and 129th Territorial Defense Brigade near Alexandria, Snagost, Mirnoye, Kazachia, Loknia, Korenevo, Plekhovo, and Pushkarnoye. And all of these are places where the Ukrainian, basically the same area where the Ukrainians have been in control of, or been trying to have control of for some time. In other words, the Ukrainians aren't advancing. The one place that's been mentioned where there might conceivably be some sign of a further Ukrainian attempt to advance is Pushkarnoye. This is located somewhat to the west, southwest of southwest of some of these positions that we've been talking about before. But the Russians, anyway, have been bombing and attacking the Ukrainians in those areas too. And then the Russians say that near Yunakovka and Miropolye, precision missile strikes wiped out 3 US-made HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, 2 transport loading vehicles, and 2 escort vehicles. So a group of Forces North talks about 1 HIMARS vehicle destroyed in Sumy region. The Russians are talking about the destruction of 3 the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about the destruction of 3 HIMARS launchers. And again, from what I can tell, these HIMARS launchers seem to have been operating inside Kursk region itself. Again, I might be wrong. Maybe I'm getting these locations wrong. But anyway, this is a very heavy toll of HIMARS vehicles. 3 HIMARS vehicles destroyed over a 24-hour period. And maybe the vehicle the Group of Forces North is talking about is another one, in which case it would be 4. Anyway, these are very, very severe losses. And the Defense Ministry says that the Air Force delivered strikes at Ukrainian reserves and ammunition and fuel depots at various places in Sumy region, that over the last 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses have amounted to up to 220 Ukrainian troops, so less than what Group of Forces North says. 19 units of armoured hardware, including 4 tanks, of which, as I said, 1 indisputably was a Challenger, 8 armoured personnel carriers, 7 armoured fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, 3 HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, 2 transport loading vehicles, and 2 field artillery guns. And then they say that over the course of the fighting in Kursk region, the Ukrainians have lost 2,860 troops, just below the 3,000 the Group of Forces North say, 41 tanks, 40 armoured personnel carriers, 23 infantry fighting vehicles, and, of course, assorted surface-to-air missile systems and the HIMARS launchers. So there we go. This is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. Redovka, the Russian newspaper, which provides us from time to time with information about the battle area, and which incidentally has its people on the ground now. It's got reporters on the ground in the area. They've been busy talking to Russian soldiers. They claimed that they claimed last night, that the Russians have recaptured the village of Malaya Lokhnia, which is located close to these 2 villages of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, and Ruskaye. Porechnoye, where the Ukrainians have been launching their various attacks. If this is correct, then the Russians are indeed undertaking significant advances and are gradually, in fact, pushing the Ukrainians back. But I'm not completely sure that this is entirely reliable information. And at the same time, given that it's now, I think, acknowledged that the Russians are indeed in control of another village called Kremenaya, I think it's gradually coming to be accepted that the Russians almost certainly also control the villages of Olgovka and Zhuravli. And, of course, it was in that general area, near Kauchuk, that the Russian Defense Ministry says that another Ukrainian column was defeated. So, where are we? Now, let me just again repeat a point that I've made many times. Ukrainian forces moving around various villages in the area of Kursk region is not in itself of any village, has no military value or significance. There is a very, very disturbing suggestion being made by some Russian commentators, which I hope is not true, which is that having failed in their primary objective, which is to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, which is now almost certainly out of reach, that the Ukrainians are instead trying to capture Russian civilians and in effect to hold them hostage. And that this is partly what the Ukrainians are trying to do by trying to capture these various villages. It's been suggested that since the Ukrainians are no longer able to capture the power station, there are various attempted advances to the east, and to the west are basically about that, and that the Russians, one of the reasons why the Russians, for example, have announced a further evacuation of civilians from a village called Glushkovo and the surrounding area, is because they're worried that Ukrainian sabotage groups might try to enter these villages and to seize Russian civilians and to take them back and to kind of hold them in effect as hostages. Now, I have not yet seen anything like that happen, and I think I must stress this, but if something like that does happen, then we are in very, very troubling territory indeed. We are indeed, in that case, looking at a repeat of the kind of tactics that the jihadi fighters used in their fights against the Russians in the Northern Caucasus. And, well, perhaps the Russian authorities are indeed concerned about that, and that may be the reason why they're evacuating civilians. But I hope that nothing like that happens. For the record, I should say that the Ukrainians also now are evacuating civilians from the villages in Sumy region, which the Russians are now bombing as they conduct their own counter-bombing and missile operations against the Ukrainians. But to repeat again, if the Ukrainians cannot capture the nuclear power station, which is located in Kurchatov, then this whole operation militarily has become pointless. And I would say also that if the Ukrainians have any kind of plans of the sort that I've just been talking about, well, that would not only be a terroristic act, but it will be one which I think would catastrophically rebound against them. It would lose them whatever remaining credit they still have outside the West. And I hope that they're not tempted to do this. In the meantime, what we can say is that this operation, the Kursk operation, far from being the success that some people in the Western media are implying, is turning into a horrible debacle. It is sucking in, exactly as Group of Forces North says, it is sucking in Ukrainian troops from all sorts of places across the contact line. It is burning up Ukrainian reserves and burning up Ukrainian armor. They've lost 4 expensive and irreplaceable surface-to-air missile systems, including an almost complete Patriot system. They've now lost at least 3 HIMARS launchers. They've lost at least 1 Challenger tank, and perhaps before long they'll lose more. They've lost over 40 tanks, probably most of them inaccessible now and cannot be brought back and repaired. All of this is happening even as their front lines collapse everywhere else. The Russians are literally at the gates of Pokrovsk. The Russian defense minister himself is telling the advanced Russian troops to keep advancing, to push on west. It looks clear it is clear that the Russians do intend to capture Pokrovsk. It is looking increasingly likely that the Russians are going to, before long, capture Donetsk itself. This operation is bringing closer Ukraine's final military collapse, probably by several months. Now, there are reports that that the Ukrainians are not satisfied with this self-inflicted disaster they've imposed on themselves in Kursk area, that they're preparing some further offensive in Zaporozhye region, where the Russians are supposed to have 90,000 men. There's said to be a convoy of Ukrainian troops in Nikopol, just on the western bank of the Dnieper. Maybe it's another plan to try to storm the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant this time. But offensives of this sort are dreadfully misconceived. What the Ukrainians needed to do was to work with the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians and try to get negotiations going. The Russians, very reluctant to negotiate, but having to keep the door to negotiations open. Now, that door, in effect, has been closed, and instead of rethinking their strategy, the Ukrainians doubling down. I have come to the view that a change of government in Kiev is not only essential, but that a withdrawal from Kursk is probably not going to be enough. The Ukrainians perhaps need to start thinking whether a full-scale withdrawal across the Dnieper, something which arguably they should have started weeks before, that a full-scale withdrawal beyond the Dnieper is now the only rational military option that they have. Anyway, there we are. That is my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Of course, this is a dynamic situation. We will see what happens. Just to remind you once more that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop. You'll find the links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's it for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.